Hello everyone! Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I've always found driving on back roads to be more interesting than taking the main highway, especially at dawn. There's a stillness to the world at 5 a.m. that you don't get at any other time. The air is cool, the sky is that vague blue-gray color, and the only sound is the rumble of your car's tires on the pavement. For me, Clara, a nurse who lives the rhythm of night shifts, this was my true dawn. It was the end of my day, a moment to decompress after the chaos of beeping, alarms, and constant pressure of the emergency room. My new home, a small rented bungalow in the middle of nowhere in Oregon, was to be my sanctuary, my antidote to the noise. Solitude was the goal. After what happened to my brother, I needed a place where the only echo would be my own thoughts. For the first few weeks, it worked. I would come in, take a hot shower, and sleep while the rest of the world went about its day. But old houses have their own habits. One window in the kitchen, the one above the sink, seemed to have a mind of its own. I was sure I locked it every morning before I went to bed, but sometimes I would wake up in the afternoon to find it unlocked, just a crack open, just enough to let in the cold air, but not enough to be alarming. Tired, I told myself. You're exhausted. After all, I was human and my job was exhausting. The first real break in my carefully constructed logic was a footprint. I came home one particularly damp morning, and as I closed the door, saw a small, distinct, wet shoe print on the welcome mat. It wasn't mine. I always took my boots off on the porch. I froze, staring at the print. It looked like a child's. My heart raced. I walked through the house with a fireplace poker in my hand, checking every room, every closet. Nothing. No one. I called the police, feeling foolish. A policeman with a tired mustache came over, looked around, and gave me a patronizing smile. "Miss, there's no sign of a break-in. Probably a neighborhood kid playing a prank." He reminded me of that actor. What's his name? The one who always plays cops? Oh yes, the De Niro. Anyway, he said I didn't have neighbors close enough for that. The implicit suggestion was that I was imagining things. The feeling of helplessness was worse than the fear. I began to doubt myself. Maybe I hadn't locked the window. Maybe the footprint had already been there. A Joan Didion quote has always stuck with me. We tell ourselves stories to survive. I live by that line. And the story I was telling myself was that of a strong woman recovering from trauma, not a helpless victim in a horror movie. I tried to hold on to that narrative, but the house seemed determined to rewrite it. I began to feel like I was being watched. A chill on the back of my neck as I washed the dishes, the feeling of eyes on my back as I walked from the car to the door. Then I found a drawing. It was in my mailbox, folded and damp from the drizzle. It was a child's drawing, drawn in crayon. It showed a house, unmistakably my own, with a smiling sun in the corner. There was a stick figure inside the house, with long hair like mine, and at the edge of the paper, peeking out from the woods that surrounded the property, was another stick figure, small, dark, just watching. There was no signature, there was nothing but that silent, haunting image. Fear stopped being a possibility and became a fact. Someone was out there. Someone knew I was alone. From that day on, the house became a prison. I spent my waking hours sitting in silence, listening, waiting. The fear was no longer about a sound or a sight, but about the realization that something was terribly out of place and no one was going to come and fix it. One night, as I lay in bed, trying in vain to sleep before a shift, I heard it. A humming sound, a low, childish, melodyless humming sound coming from outside near the basement vent that sat just below my window. It was an intimate sound and terribly invasive. I remembered something my brother had once told me about dealing with bullies. You can't show fear. Heart hammering against my ribs, I stood up, walked out onto the dark, cold porch, and stared into the darkness where the vent had been. "This is my house," I said, my voice firmer than I'd expected. "You're not welcome here." The buzzing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy. For 3 days, nothing happened. The silence returned to just silence. I began to think that it had worked, that somehow I had won. I felt a cautious pride. On the 4th morning, I left for work, feeling almost normal. That's when I saw it. Stuck under the windshield wiper of my car was another drawing, same style, same crayon. This time, it showed the inside of a car. A stick figure was in the driver's seat with my long hair, and in the back seat, small and dark, was the other one. I stood there, keys in hand, engine off. I looked through the window at the back seat. It was empty, but the image of the cartoon was etched in my mind. Does everyone have a limit? Have I crossed mine and not even realized it? The real terror is not its presence in your home. It's the possibility that when you finally run away, it has already found a way to come with you. My name is Leo. I'm a historian, which is a fancy way of saying that I spend my days sifting through the lives of dead people. I've always liked the smell of old houses. It's a mix of dust, dry wood, and what I like to think of as memories trapped in the walls. So when I rented this mansion in rural Pennsylvania to finish my book, I felt right at home. The place was practically empty, which suited my need for solitude perfectly. The owner had left behind only a few pieces of heavy furniture and in the upstairs hallway, a black rotary telephone, heavy as a brick. It was, of course, unplugged. The cord had been cut from the wall decades ago. It was just a relic, a piece of decoration that I cherished. The first time it rang, I was in the kitchen. It was almost midnight. It was a single ring, a short metallic trim that cut through the silence of the house. I stopped, coffee mug in hand. The sound was unmistakable, but impossible. I went into the hallway and stared at the phone. The metal dial was still, the receiver in the cradle. I checked the cut cord, covered in dust. It must have been the wind or some animal in the attic. The human brain is expert at creating patterns out of chaos. I went back to my papers, but the logic of the house had been subtly altered. The silence was no longer peaceful. It seemed to be waiting. 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, there were 3 rings, clear and insistent. I was at my desk, a few feet down the hall. I stood up so fast my chair fell backward. I ran to the phone, my heart pounding in my throat, and stared at it as if I might catch it in the act. Nothing. The silence returned, heavier than before. I began to feel like the protagonist of one of those Gothic tales I read in college. Me, the rational academic, being haunted by an inanimate object. I began to doubt my own mind. The night before, I couldn't remember the name of a Civil War general, a name I had written down hundreds of times. What was it? Oh yes, Sherman. My mind was playing tricks on me. I followed the thinking of Marshall McLuhan, who said that the medium is the message. Maybe the problem was not who I was calling, but the act of calling itself. The dead phone, the non-existent line. The message was the impossibility itself. It was a violation of the rules of the physical world. This idea did not calm me. On the contrary, it terrified me. The terror came not from a threat, but from the realization that reality was more fragile than I had imagined, that something was out of place and no one was going to come and fix it. The whole house seemed complicit, maintaining a reverent silence over the phone. The escalation reached its peak on a stormy night. Lightning flashed across the hallway, and the phone began to ring incessantly, a shrill, desperate ringing that pierced the thunder. It was a sound that demanded to be answered. In a fit of fear and morbid curiosity, I lunged for it and snatched the receiver from its cradle. The ringing stopped. I held the receiver to my ear, expecting static, silence, anything. What I heard was a low hum, and beneath it, a voice. It was a faint, distorted whisper, like a long-distance radio transmission. The voice repeated a series of numbers and then went silent. I froze, holding the cold plastic to my ear until the line went dead. I replaced the receiver with shaking hands. I wrote the numbers down on a piece of paper, my handwriting barely legible. The next day, with sunlight streaming through the windows, the whole thing felt like a nightmare. But the numbers were there in my notebook. Out of professional duty, or perhaps out of a need to expose the hoax, I looked up the numbers online. They were the coordinates of a location in Vietnam. With a little more research, I cross-referenced the information. The numbers matched the service record of a soldier who lived in that same city and was reported missing in action in 1968. His registered address was this house. I didn't run away. The fear is still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But it's been replaced by something else, a heavy sense of responsibility. I, who spend my life giving voice to the dead through documents and letters, have received a direct call. Maybe the mistake was in answering, or maybe the mistake would have been in not answering. Now I sit in the dark, the book forgotten, and just stare at the phone. Is all history a form of haunting? Is the past not dead, but just waiting for someone to answer the call? And what happens to a historian when he or she becomes the sole recipient of a story that was never written? I don't know. All I know is that I'm waiting for it to ring again. I've always been drawn to abandoned places. My name is Sam, and my job, if you can call it that, is to explore and film dilapidated buildings for a small internet channel. There's a beauty in decay, a story told through mold and rusted metal. To edit the hours of footage I shoot, I need absolute silence, so I rented a remote cabin in the mountains of North Carolina. The irony of finding a pristine place to work on images of decay was not lost on me. The cabin was simple, made of wood, and smelled of pine and a cold fireplace. It was nestled deep in a valley with no neighbors, no cell service, just me and the trees. The problem started out mundane. Things were disappearing, nothing important, just the kind of items you swear you left in one place and find in another. My lens cap, which I always keep in my right pocket, had turned up in the spice rack. My car keys, which I hang on a hook by the door, were in the bathroom. I chalked it up to exhaustion. Long walks and intense concentration on editing can affect memory. I was working on a video about an old sanatorium, a particularly oppressive place, and I assumed its dark atmosphere had stuck with me. One afternoon, while searching for a lost HDMI cable, I opened a closet in the living room. At the back, behind some mothball-smelling blankets, I found a cardboard box sealed with yellowed tape. Written on it in black marker was just one word: "Watch me." As an urban explorer, my curiosity overcame any common sense. I took the box into the living room and opened it. Inside were a dozen unlabeled VHS tapes and an old VCR. I plugged the box into the cabin's small television. The picture came on grainy and choppy. The first tape showed a thin, middle-aged man with tired eyes sitting in the same room as me. He introduced himself as Robert. He talked about loneliness and the strange feeling that the cabin didn't want him there. He described objects moving by themselves, keys, a lens cap. My blood ran cold. I kept watching. Tape after tape, I watched Robert deteriorate. He began nailing boards to the windows, talking about eyes in the trees. His voice, once calm, became a paranoid whisper. He reminded me of that actor who had been in the movie, the one about the lighthouse. Oh, Willem Dafoe. He had the same feverish intensity. I follow the line of filmmaker John Carpenter. Evil has no limits or boundaries. I was watching evil in action, not the evil of monsters, but the subtle evil of isolation and fear eating away at a mind. I turned off the TV, but the feeling of being watched was palpable. I was living Robert's script. Doubt began to consume me. Was the house doing the same to me? Or were the tapes some kind of trigger, a suggestion planted to lead me down the same path? The fear came not from a physical threat, but from the realization that my reality was being shaped by a pre-existing narrative. The last tape was almost unwatchable. The picture was dark. The camera on the floor pointed at the front door. Robert was nowhere to be seen. All that could be heard was his heavy breathing and the sound of the rain outside. He kept whispering, "He's here. He looks like me. He wants to come in." After a long silence, the door was unlocked and opened. The tape cut to static. That night, I was awakened by a sound. Someone was knocking on the front door, softly, rhythmically. I lay paralyzed in bed, my heart pounding wildly. Robert's words echoed in my head. "He looks like me." I didn't respond. The knocking continued for perhaps an hour and then stopped. I gathered my things in the dark as quietly as I could. I didn't take the tapes. I left them for the next tenant. As I walked out to my car in the gray light of dawn, I saw something on the porch. It was a small video camera, identical to mine, perched on the railing. It wasn't mine. I had mine in my backpack. I froze, staring into the dark lens that seemed to be watching me. Maybe I'd made a mistake watching the tapes. Or maybe, as my grandmother used to say, there are places that hold echoes. And if you're quiet enough, you start to echo with them. Is paranoia contagious? Or do certain walls learn a pattern of madness and impose it on whoever lives inside? I don't know the answer. All I know is that now, when I look at my own face on my computer screen, for a split second, I see Robert's tired eyes. I've always felt that most people don't understand the desert. They see it as empty, but I see perfect architecture, a brutalist geometry shaped by wind and time. My name is Julia. I'm an architect, and I rented this modernist glass and steel house in the middle of the Arizona desert to focus on a competition. The order calms me. Every night before bed, I would line up my pens and drawing pencils in perfect parallel on my desk. It was a ritual, my way of closing the day and setting the stage for the next. The first violation was barely noticeable. I woke up one morning and a single 6B pencil was out of alignment, moved maybe 2 millimeters to the left. A nothing. A vibration from the floor, an oversight on my part the night before. I readjusted it and thought nothing more of it. But the next day, a book I had been using as a paperweight on the corner of my desk had been swapped out for another from the same stack. Same size, same function, but not the one I had chosen. It was a replacement, not a clutter. I began to feel a strange cognitive dissonance, a sense that the rules of my space were being rewritten by an invisible hand. The situation escalated slowly, with a frightening logic of its own. The 3 chairs at my dining table, which I had kept perfectly aligned with the edge of the rug, were turned inward, forming a precise triangle in the center of the room. It wasn't clutter, it was design. It was an intentional decision. I began taking pictures of the rooms before bed, a testament to my own doubting sanity. The photos weren't lying. I wasn't forgetting. I was being edited. The stress began to get to me. I tried to remember the name of a famous architectural photographer, the one who always captured clean lines. His name was Iwan. Iwan Ban? Or was it something else? The lapse in memory, however small, felt like another piece being removed from my board. I follow the thinking of Gaston Bachelard, who wrote in The Poetics of Space that the house is our corner of the world, our first universe. But what happens when the universe starts to conspire against you? What happens when your corner becomes someone else's stage? I felt constantly watched, not by a pair of eyes, but by the house itself. The glass walls designed to connect me with the landscape now seemed to expose me to something that was inside with me. The terror reached its peak in a way I could never have imagined. I woke up one Wednesday and walked to my desk. On it, on a fresh sheet of tracing paper, was a drawing, a floor plan. It had been drawn with my own tools, my compasses, my rulers, my India ink. It was an incredibly complex and detailed architectural plan for a maze, an impossible structure that seemed to fold in on itself. In the exact center of the maze, drawn with surgical precision, was a small square with the notation, "You are here." There was no screaming. There was just absolute cold, the realization that my logic, my art, had been learned and used against me. This was no haunting. It was a form of intelligence, one that communicated through my own language. I packed my things methodically, refusing to give in to panic. With the car now running, I went back for one last look. On the vast glass wall of the room, someone, or something, had used the morning condensation to draw a single, perfect circle, exactly at eye level. A window, within a window, a vantage point. I drove away, watching that geometric masterpiece disappear into the horizon. The ending never explains everything, leaving a purposeful ambiguity. Does every perfectly ordered space yearn for consciousness? Does the human mind, when projecting its logic onto a place, end up giving it a life of its own? Perhaps the mistake was not in seeking solitude in such a rigorous place, but rather in believing that the rules were mine. The final reflection that remains for me is a question that may not have an answer. When you build a house for your thoughts, what else can you decide to live there? There's a particular smell to old seaside homes, a mixture of salt, dust, and a ghost of linseed oil. To me, it's the smell of work. My name is Elias, and I restore art. I breathed life back into canvases that time, and neglect have left for dead. It's slow work, requiring an almost monastic patience. That's why I accepted the commission to restore a single 18th century family portrait on a secluded property on the coast of Maine. The owners were going to be in Europe for a month, leaving me alone with a house, the sea, and the lady in the painting. Isolation for me has always been a tool, not a threat. The house was one of those Newport cottages, which is a euphemism for a clapboard mansion with more rooms than I could count, all filled with furniture covered in white sheets like an assembly of ghosts. My focus was on the main living room, where the portrait hung over a marble fireplace. It was a large, dark, cracked canvas. It depicted the family matriarch, a woman named Althea, whose stern face was barely distinguishable beneath layers of yellowed varnish and centuries of grime. My job was simple: clean, stabilize, and fill in the gaps. For the first few days, the process was meditative. The soft sound of my cotton swab rolling over the canvas, the chemical smell of solvents, the creaking of a house in the Atlantic wind. It was while cleaning the upper right-hand corner, an area of dark, impenetrable background, that I found the first anomaly. Beneath a particularly thick layer of grime, a detail undocumented in the commission's archives emerged. A small window, no bigger than a matchbox, painted on the wall behind Althea. It was odd, but not unprecedented. Archives get lost, details get forgotten. I continued my work. It was in the second week that logic began to unravel. I was working on Althea's face. As the layers of darkened enamel gave way, her expression seemed to change. What had been austere rigidity began to look like a deep melancholy. The corners of her mouth seemed to have turned down in resigned sadness. I attributed it to the lighting, to my own tired eyes projecting emotions onto the canvas. But the feeling that something was wrong persisted. The real shock came when I returned to the small window. After hours of meticulous work, the dark patch inside the window frame began to lighten, revealing something beneath. It wasn't landscape. It was a face, pale, tiny, and indistinct, but unmistakably a face staring out of that painted window. I recoiled from the screen, my heart pounding. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was AI repentance. An earlier image that the artist had painted over, and that was now emerging. It was a technical explanation, a plausible one, but it didn't look like an old sketch. It looked fresh, as if the paint was still setting. My professionalism, my armor against the inexplicable, began to crack. I tried to remember the formula for a gel solvent I used. Gellin, no, that wasn't the name. What was the name of that main component? That aromatic solvent? My mind went blank for a moment, a frustrating gap in my own mental database. From that day on, my work became a terrified investigation. With each layer I peeled away, the painting revealed more, not of its original glory, but of a secret that had been deliberately buried. Other figures began to emerge from the dark background, like photographs developing in a dark room. They were children, 3 of them, standing behind Althea's chair, their forms almost transparent, their faces thin and solemn. Family records stated that Althea had no children. The house seemed to have grown cold, and the whistling of the wind began to sound like whispers coming from the living room itself. I was completely alone, but I felt like the least lonely man in the world. I followed the lead of Susan Sontag, who said, "Every photograph is a memento mori." I began to believe that this painting was one too, but not a passive memorial. It was an active witness, a crime scene whose evidence I was uncovering. The need to see the final image, to understand the full story, became an obsession that overcame my fear. I decided to work through the night, to finish once and for all. With the house creaking around me and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks outside, I focused on the last part that hadn't been cleaned, Althea's hands resting in her lap. As the last veil of grime faded beneath my swab, the final truth of the image revealed itself. Althea's left hand was not simply resting, she held a large, ornate iron key, and her right hand was not resting in her lap. It was resting on the younger boy's shoulder, a gesture that no longer seemed protective but possessive, holding him firmly in place. And her face, now completely clean and clear under my working light, was neither stern nor sad. Her expression was one of cold, unwavering pride, her eyes looking directly at me, not like the subject of a portrait, but like a guard. Just as I realized what I was seeing, I heard a sound coming from upstairs, a loud, metallic, impossible sound. It was the sound of a heavy iron lock being unlocked, coming from a wing of the house that the owners had told me had been locked for generations. I didn't wait to find out which door it opened. I abandoned everything, my valuable tools, my notes, my coat. I ran outside into the cold, salty night, got into my car, and drove away without looking back. Now, I am in an anonymous motel hundreds of miles from that coast. What does a restorer do when art confronts him? My purpose was to reveal, not to liberate. Was each layer of varnish like dirt over a grave, and I, in my professional arrogance, had just dug it up? The question that haunts me, that keeps me awake, is a reflection on my own art. Did I give Althea control by giving her her face back? And if she was guarding those children in the painting, who is now guarding them in the house? I've always felt that silence has a weight. At the firehouse, even on the quietest mornings, there was always an underlying hum. The radio, the truck engine, the breathing of other men sleeping. It was a living silence. Here, in this cabin in the woods of Washington, silence is a different thing. It's a vacuum, a predator. My name is George, and after 30 years of running toward the noise, I've retired to its opposite. After my wife Martha passed away, the noise in our house became unbearable. I thought the silence of the woods would be a cure, but I was wrong. The cabin is a simple, functional A-frame, the kind of place built with purpose, not comfort, in mind. It was in the basement, while searching for a circuit breaker, that I found the incinerator chute. It was a holdover from another era, a square metal tube that ran down from the wall of the upstairs kitchen to the basement, where a cast iron furnace lay dormant and rusting. The opening upstairs had been sealed with plaster, but down here, its rusty mouth hung open inches from the cement floor. On the first day, I found a single wooden button at the end of the chute, probably fallen from an old garment years ago. I cleaned it off and thought nothing more of it. A week later, something prompted me to check again. There, in the same place where the button had been, was a silver thimble, the kind Martha used for her mending. I stared at it for a full minute, my firefighter's brain running through the logical possibilities. Mice? A draft dislodging debris stuck in the walls? No explanation seemed adequate. The gutter was a closed system. Nothing went in, nothing went out. I picked up the thimble. It was cold, and I felt an inexplicable sadness as I held it, a pain that was not my own. The objects kept appearing, one every few days, like offerings from an unseen source. A tiny blue jay feather, a milky glass bead, a smooth white pebble of the kind found in streams. Each one was small, insignificant, and heartbreaking. I began to sense that I was not alone, but the presence was not threatening. It was shy, watchful. It was as if the house, or something in it, was trying to communicate in the only way it knew how. My mind, accustomed to assessing risk and following protocol, began to fail me. I tried to remember the code for ventilation in stairwells in commercial buildings, something I knew by heart. It was the fire code, 1022.9. No, that was about exits. The information, once so solid, had gone up in smoke. I've always been struck by a quote from Joan Didion. We tell ourselves stories to survive. I follow that line of thinking. The story I was telling myself was that someone, long ago, perhaps a child, had used this gutter as a safe for their little treasures, and that the vibrations of the house were slowly dislodging them. It was a sad story, but a logical one. It calmed me. It would allow me to separate my grief from the grief that seemed to permeate the very fabric of this cabin. It was someone else's story, not mine. The illusion was shattered on a rainy Tuesday. The dampness made the house seem even quieter, the sound of the rain a soft patter on the roof. I went down to the basement with a sense of somber ritual. I shone my flashlight into the gutter. There was something new. It wasn't an object at all, but a piece of paper, folded into a perfect square. My hand shook as I picked it up. The paper was old, brittle. I unfolded it. It was a child's drawing, drawn in crayon, an A-frame house, a sun in the corner, and 3 toothpick figures holding hands, a tall man, a woman in a triangular dress, and a small child between them, and the child held a single blue feather. The air left my lungs. I turned the paper over. On the back, written in a childish, hesitant hand, was a single word: paper. My name wasn't there, but it didn't need to be. That drawing was a mirror, an impossible reflection of a life I'd never had, of a loss that wasn't mine, but connected to mine in a profane way. That knowledge, that intimacy, was the ultimate violation. The terror came not from a monster or a ghost, but from the realization that my solitude was a dialogue. 2222. My grief had found an echo, and that echo was responding. I climbed the stairs, left the basement, and closed the door behind me. I walked through the silent house and over to the kitchen wall where the gutter had been sealed. I placed my palm on the smooth plaster. It was cold. There was nothing to see, nothing to hear, only the crushing certainty of a shared sadness. The next morning, I packed my bags. I left the small treasures, including the drawing, lined up on the basement windowsill. That was where they belonged. Now, as I drive down the winding road, away from the forest, the final thought dawns on me. 3, in my work, I have learned that fires can ignite spontaneously, materials left in piles, heating up until they reach the point of combustion. Does grief work the same way? Can a house filled with the loss of a family lie dormant for years until a new source of grief, my own, is introduced, providing the heat needed to start everything burning again? The mistake was not moving into a house with a story. The mistake was thinking that my own story would not become part of it. The question that haunts me, the question that the reader may share, is what do we do when we realize that we are not being haunted, but that we are the haunting? I've always felt that silence has a weight. At the firehouse, even on the quietest mornings, there was always an underlying hum. The radio, the truck engine, the breathing of other men sleeping. It was a living silence. Here, in this cabin in the woods of Washington, silence is a different thing. It's a vacuum, a predator. My name is George, and after 30 years of running toward the noise, I've retired to its opposite. After my wife Martha passed away, the noise in our house became unbearable. I thought the silence of the woods would be a cure, but I was wrong. The cabin is a simple, functional A-frame, the kind of place built with purpose, not comfort, in mind. It was in the basement, while searching for a circuit breaker, that I found the incinerator chute. It was a holdover from another era, a square metal tube that ran down from the wall of the upstairs kitchen to the basement, where a cast iron furnace lay dormant and rusting. The opening upstairs had been sealed with plaster, but down here, its rusty mouth hung open inches from the cement floor. On the first day, I found a single wooden button at the end of the chute, probably fallen from an old garment years ago. I cleaned it off and thought nothing more of it. A week later, something prompted me to check again. There, in the same place where the button had been, was a silver thimble, the kind Martha used for her mending. I stared at it for a full minute, my firefighter's brain running through the logical possibilities. Mice? A draft dislodging debris stuck in the walls? No explanation seemed adequate. The gutter was a closed system. Nothing went in, nothing went out. I picked up the thimble. It was cold, and I felt an inexplicable sadness as I held it, a pain that was not my own. The objects kept appearing, one every few days, like offerings from an unseen source. A tiny blue jay feather, a milky glass bead, a smooth white pebble of the kind found in streams. Each one was small, insignificant, and heartbreaking. I began to sense that I was not alone, but the presence was not threatening. It was shy, watchful. It was as if the house, or something in it, was trying to communicate in the only way it knew how. My mind, accustomed to assessing risk and following protocol, began to fail me. I tried to remember the code for ventilation in stairwells in commercial buildings, something I knew by heart. It was the fire code, 1022.9. No, that was about exits. The information, once so solid, had gone up in smoke. I've always been struck by a quote from Joan Didion. We tell ourselves stories to survive. I follow that line of thinking. The story I was telling myself was that someone, long ago, perhaps a child, had used this gutter as a safe for their little treasures, and that the vibrations of the house were slowly dislodging them. It was a sad story, but a logical one. It calmed me. It would allow me to separate my grief from the grief that seemed to permeate the very fabric of this cabin. It was someone else's story, not mine. The illusion was shattered on a rainy Tuesday. The dampness made the house seem even quieter, the sound of the rain a soft patter on the roof. I went down to the basement with a sense of somber ritual. I shone my flashlight into the gutter. There was something new. It wasn't an object at all, but a piece of paper folded into a perfect square. My hand shook as I picked it up. The paper was old, brittle. I unfolded it. It was a child's drawing, drawn in crayon, an A-frame house, a sun in the corner, and 3 toothpick figures holding hands, a tall man, a woman in a triangular dress, and a small child between them, and the child held a single blue feather. The air left my lungs. I turned the paper over. On the back, written in a childish, hesitant hand, was a single word: paper. My name wasn't there, but it didn't need to be. That drawing was a mirror, an impossible reflection of a life I'd never had, of a loss that wasn't mine, but connected to mine in a profane way. That knowledge, that intimacy, was the ultimate violation. The terror came not from a monster or a ghost, but from the realization that my solitude was a dialogue. 2,222. My grief had found an echo, and that echo was responding. I climbed the stairs, left the basement, and closed the door behind me. I walked through the silent house and over to the kitchen wall where the gutter had been sealed. I placed my palm on the smooth plaster. It was cold. There was nothing to see, nothing to hear, only the crushing certainty of a shared sadness. The next morning, I packed my bags. I left the small treasures, including the drawing, lined up on the basement windowsill. That was where they belonged. Now, as I drive down the winding road, away from the forest, the final thought dawns on me. 3, in my work, I have learned that fires can ignite spontaneously. Materials left in piles, heating up until they reach the point of combustion. Does grief work the same way? Can a house filled with the loss of a family lie dormant for years until a new source of grief, my own, is introduced, providing the heat needed to start everything burning again? The mistake was not moving into a house with a story. The mistake was thinking that my own story would not become part of it. The question that haunts me, the question that the reader may share, is what do we do when we realize that we are not being haunted, but that we are the haunting? I've always liked the comfortable imprecision of old cities. As a cartographer, I spend my life translating the world into exact data, into lines and numbers that don't lie. But there's a different honesty to the way a Boston street, paved 300 years ago, refuses to be a perfectly straight line. That's why I was drawn to this apartment on the top floor of a brownstone on Beacon Hill. It was a place with history, with creaky floors and wavy window panes that distorted the light. My name is Maya, and my work is the obsessive pursuit of spatial truth. As a matter of habit, the first thing I did when I moved in was to map the apartment with a laser rangefinder, recording every inch in a notebook. It was my way of taking ownership, of understanding my new container. The first anomaly was so small that I chalked it up to my own error. A week after my initial measurement, I measured the living room again. The north wall was 3 inches shorter. Impossible. I must have positioned the laser incorrectly the first time, or perhaps the digital tape measure needed a new battery. I noted the new measurement with a twinge of professional irritation and moved on. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Space, my most reliable constant, had faltered. The real break in logic came in the hallway. It was a short hallway, connecting the living room to the bedroom. I had measured it at 12 feet long. One night, walking down it, it seemed longer. I stopped and instinctively counted my steps. 14. The day before, it had been 12. I went back, picked up the laser tracker, and pointed it at the far wall. The digital screen blinked and read 14 feet. A shiver ran down my spine. The space was not static. It was changing. During the night, in silence, the apartment stretched and shrank like something trying to breathe. My meticulous map, my grid for sure, was now a work of fiction. The terror that set in was of a peculiar geographical nature. It was not fear of a presence, but fear of the absence of rules. The view from the wavy glass window began to seem sinister. The street below seemed farther away at times, the people like figures in a doll's house. I began to feel a subtle, constant vertigo. My confidence in my own perception, the most vital tool of my trade, was going haywire. One day, while trying to explain an old project to a colleague over the phone, I couldn't remember the name of a basic cartographic projection. It's the one that distorts the poles to maintain the shapes. The projection of, what's it called? My mind, a file of geodetic data, was corrupting along with the apartment. I followed the thought of Hannah Arendt, who said that the reality of the world is guaranteed by the presence of others. What we see and hear is real because it can be seen and heard by others. 3,333. But I was alone. There was no one to confirm that the ceiling seemed lower or that the room seemed wider. My reality was becoming unmoored from the shared world, and I was adrift in an ocean of unstable space. Loneliness became my enemy, for it was the only witness to my collapsing sanity. The height of the threat was not a sound or a sight. It was the architecture itself becoming a weapon. I woke in the middle of the night, thirsty. I got up and walked down the hallway to the kitchen. I took a few steps and stopped. The kitchen door, normally just a few feet away, seemed impossibly far away, a small rectangle at the end of a tunnel of darkness. My heart began to pound. I turned. The door to my bedroom was equally far away. The hallway had stretched to an impossible length, trapping me in its middle. There was nowhere to run. The floor seemed to tilt subtly beneath my feet. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed up by the wrong geometry, with no echo, no resonance. It was the purest terror I had ever known, that of being trapped not by walls, but by the very absence of defined boundaries. In that endless hallway, panic eventually gave way to a strange resignation. I sat on the floor and waited. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe minutes, maybe hours. Then, in the blink of an eye, everything was back to normal. The kitchen door was closed. The bedroom door was closed too. The hallway was only 12 paces long. The next morning, I didn't pack my bags. I simply grabbed my wallet and keys and left, leaving everything behind. Now, sitting in an anonymous cafe miles away, I stare at a subway map on the wall, a diagram of perfectly logical lines and dots. My job was to believe in these maps. But how do you map a place that refuses to be measured? The final thought that haunts me is about the nature of space itself. Do we treat it as a passive stage for our lives when in fact it is an actor with its own intentions? What happens when a place decides it no longer agrees with its own blueprints? The question that remains, the one that will keep me awake at night, is not whether the house was haunted. It is, if a place can change its own dimensions to erase the path in front of you, how can you be sure you will ever find your way out? I've always felt that you can feel the weather change before any instrument can. It's a sensation on your skin, a change in the quality of the light, a weight in the air that speaks a language older than science. My name is Aris Thorne, and I'm an atmospheric physicist. My job is to translate that ancient language into the modern dialects of data and graphs. So the isolation of a remote weather station on the high plains of Colorado never bothered me. Loneliness was just a controlled variable. The company of the machines, with their constant hum and predictable logic, was all I needed. The house, or station as we called it, was a mix of cutting-edge technology and 1970s decay. The lab gleamed with monitors and servers, but my quarters had peeling wallpaper and a lingering smell of stale coffee. It was in this space that the first strange element manifested itself, not as a sound or a sight, but as a whisper in the data. A micro fluctuation in barometric pressure lasting less than a second, with no wind or temperature change to explain it. An anomalous radio spike, too brief to analyze, coming from nowhere. These were ghosts in the machine, the kind of background noise you learn to ignore, to chalk up to a sense of failure or a solar flare. These were errors that could be rationalized away. The first break in logic occurred on a cloudless night, with the sky so clear that satellites could be seen streaking through the stars. All my instruments screamed in unison. An event had occurred. A perfect circle of air, about 50 meters in diameter, a mere 200 meters from the station, suddenly cooled to 30 degrees below ambient temperature. The pressure at its center skyrocketed. A single burst of radio waves at a frequency I had never seen before emanated from the same point. The event lasted exactly 3.14 seconds and then disappeared completely. The external cameras showed nothing. The thermal sensors returned to normal. It was an impossible physical phenomenon, perfectly measured and utterly inexplicable. I felt helpless, not because I was afraid, but because my data was irrefutable, and yet it described something that could not possibly exist. I was isolated with a fact that violated reality itself. The terror, when it came, was not a crescendo, but an escalation of anomalies. The events became daily, coming closer and closer together. I began to feel them physically, a sudden heaviness in my chest that corresponded to a pressure spike on the screen, a patch of cold in the hallway where there was no draft. The static on the radio receivers began to take on a strange rhythm, a pattern hidden beneath the chaos. My own mind began to fail me. I was trying to catalog a cloud formation I had seen at sunset, the ones that look like lenses. Clouds, what are they called? Altocumulus? No, the specific name had escaped me. My mental taxonomy, my greatest pride, was eroding. As the great Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I agree with that line of thinking. The problem was that I had the evidence. It was on my screens, on my graphs, in the server logs. What I needed was a statement that didn't sound like the ramblings of a madman. I was being watched, not by a person, but by a phenomenon with intent. I was being probed, measured, analyzed with the same cold precision that I applied to the atmosphere. My laboratory had become a petri dish. The threat peaked without warning. A massive event registered on every sensor, stronger and longer than any before. But this time, the triangulation data showed something different. The source wasn't out there on the windswept plains. It was in here. The data pointed to a singular origin in space and time. The center of my server room. With a cry of panic and rage, I grabbed a fire extinguisher and broke down the door. The room was cold and silent. The servers hummed as usual, but a monitor, which I had left on a diagnostic screen, now displayed something new. A plain text file, the cursor blinking at the end of a single long line of binary code. There was no doubt in my mind. This was the message, the answer to my listening. I didn't read it. I didn't decode it. Staring into that code was like staring into an abyss, and I felt with absolute certainty that if I understood it, it would possess me. It was knowledge at its most dangerous. In that moment, my identity as a scientist died, and a more primal creature focused only on survival took over. I shut down the station's main power, cut the satellite feed, and erased the last 10 days of data. I reported a catastrophic system failure, a power surge that fried everything. It was a lie, but it felt like the greatest truth he had ever told. I left the station at dawn. As I drove away, the structure shrinking in my rearview mirror, a final reflection took shape. I have spent my life listening to the universe, searching for order and pattern in the cosmic noise. The fundamental premise of my science was that we were the only ones listening. But what if, by pointing our instruments into the darkness, we were not just observing, but also sending an invitation? What if something, upon noticing our eavesdropping, decided to speak back not across light years, but directly to our server room? The fear is not that we are alone in the universe. The fear is that we are not, and that when I knocked on the door, someone on the other side had just opened it. The question that will haunt me forever is not what the code said. It is, what did my presence in that place, my own lonely consciousness, represent that someone or something decided was worth responding to?